Hello everyone, here is the macroeconomic perspective of Budget 2022-23. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the budget on 1st February 2022. But even before that, it faced several competing demands. On one hand, the government's fiscal deficit or total borrowings from the market was a concern. On the other hand, there were demands for continued support to the weaker sections of the economy. If budget provided direct financial support to various sections of the society, the fiscal deficit, which was already more than twice the potential norms, would worsen. If the budget tried to sharply curtail expenditure, it might hurt vast sections of the economy that are already struggling in the wake of COVID-induced disruptions. In the end, budget included a strategy that substantially ramped up capital expenditure or capex, that is expenditure towards making new productive assets, while largely holding back revenue expenditure, that is expenditure to meet day-to-day expenses. Now, what were the challenges facing the economy? India's GDP growth rate has been decelerating since 2017-18, with unemployment touching a 4-decade high. GDP growth rate in 2019-20 was just 3.7% when COVID-19 pandemic hit. Between a sharp contraction and an equally sharp recovery, the next two financial years essentially amounted to the loss of 2 full years of incomes and jobs. But the recovery was a little lopsided, pointing towards a K-shaped recovery, which meant the weaker sections of the society facing the burns. The chart here shows while overall GDP has recovered, the most important component of GDP, private final consumption expenditure, or the money that people spend in the individual capacity, which accounts for 56% of all GDP, is below the pre-COVID pandemic level. The picture appears worse when one looks at the per capita levels of GDP and PFCE. The average PFCE or expenditure is below 2018 levels. Also, these are still arithmetic mean figures. They suggest that a large section of the population is below even this average level. People are spending less because employment levels have seen a secular decline since 2016. COVID only made matters worse. Weak PFCE meant that the other big engines of GDP growth, that is investments or gross fixed capital formation, would remain weak. That is because weak demand has led to low capacity utilizations, and that takes away from any incentive from private businesses to invest in new capacities, create new jobs and income streams for people. The only other engine was the money government spends. But too much spending here was ruled out because the fiscal deficit was already twice the potential norms. So what strategy was chosen for the budget? The standout feature of Budget 2022-23 is that the government has chosen to significantly ramp up capital expenditure while largely restricting revenue expenditure. This capex push will get reflected in the investments component of the GDP. The chief advantage of capital expenditure is that it gives much higher returns to the overall GDP. Capital expenditure provides better returns not just by creating new jobs, but also by creating new productive assets that boost future productivity. Here's how government hopes this capex push will play out and lead India's economic recovery. New roads, ports, etc. will not only create new jobs, but will also reinvigorate several other industries through forward and backward linkages. For instance, apart from new labourers, a new bridge will need cement, iron and steel, etc. It will increase the demand for engineers and other technical and managerial professionals. When done on a large scale, such expenditure will leave people with more income, and that in turn will boost the aggregate demand, the PFCE component. That fresh demand will further incentivize the private sector to boost investments of their own and in fact take the lead on future investments. Thus, according to the budget strategy, a capex push by the government can dig India out of the current slump and create a virtuous cycle of growth. In time, as tax revenues from new economic activity increase and as private sector investments become self-sustaining, the government will retreat from its leading role in investment, thus bringing down its borrowing requirements. Now, the question that can be asked is that how is this strategy different from what has been done by the countries such as the US? Countries such as the US unleashed a massive fiscal response to the COVID crisis that involved a lot of money flowing out of government's coffers to people's accounts. In India, most of the help was either in the form of free food grains, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and credit guarantees, not actual money flowing to the small and distressed firms, just guarantees on the loan they may take. As such, there is no comparison between the direct financial help that developed countries provided, even in percentage terms, and what India provided. It is for this reason that most estimates suggest a sharp increase in poverty and inequality in India post-COVID. In contrast, the US was among the countries that have seen a genuine V-shaped recovery, getting back to the pre-pandemic growth path, not just the level. But countries such as the US too have ended up facing a problem, that is inflation. When lots of money flowed into people's hands, the aggregate demand recovered far too quickly even as supply disruptions persisted, thus creating historic levels of inflation. It is another matter that even with depressed demand, India too has seen fairly high inflation over the last 2 years. Similar to the capex push in India, in the US, President Joe Biden has been pushing for an ambitious $1.9 trillion plan called Build Back Better, aimed at growing the US economy from the bottom up and the middle out. So the question remains, will the capex push in the budget succeed? There are many merits of this higher capital expenditure by the government. First of all, it will generate demand in the economy, attract private investments over long-term and sustain economic growth. Then by creating long-term assets, the economy will benefit as it helps generate revenue for many years. At face value, a number of preconditions appear to be in place. The government has announced various reforms including the National Infrastructure Pipeline (NIP), the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, lower corporate taxes and privatization. Corporates have deleveraged their balance sheets during the pandemic. The corporate debt equity ratio has fallen broadly across industries from 0.79 in FY19 and 0.82 in FY20 to 0.63 in FY21. Add to that the creation of a bad bank, which will enable the banking system to be ready to give loans when the private sector demands them. But there are reasons why this may not succeed. That's because these are not normal times. There are deep scars in the economy, especially in the informal sector, which accounts for 90% of all jobs, and aggregate demand is still quite weak. Capacity utilization levels are far below the point where companies may contemplate ramping up investments. Economists believe that success of this strategy would depend on the way these projects are implemented. As such, these capital assets have long gestation periods, and the expected benefits of the common people may take time to accrue. Hence, the success of this budget will all depend on the way it is implemented. And as Economic Survey quoted, a targeted focus on capital expenditure with its resulting multiplier effect will be vital in sustaining the economic growth. Hoping for the best, we conclude this discussion. Thank you so much for watching. Comment, share and subscribe for more such content.